I don't think you've enjoyed the life of the mind until you have seen someone, some philosopher or scientist, talk about the contextual legitimacy of the burqa or female genital excision or any of these other practices that emerge out of other cultures, which are just so clearly the cause of needless human misery. And yet we have convinced ourselves that somehow that science is by definition a value-free space, and therefore we can't make value judgments about practices needlessly subverting our opportunity to live in a happy and sane world.
And creationists reject evolution specifically, but more importantly, they also reject methodological naturalism, which is an integral aspect of the application of science. And creationists want to replace that in some applications with a belief in magic. Now, creationists typically don't admit that they believe in magic. They say they believe in miracles. But miracles and magic share essentially the same definition. That is the evocation of supernatural forces or entities to control or forecast natural events in ways which are inexplicable by science because they defy the laws of physics. And if you need a further illustration of that, Adam was created in what was considered in the Hebrew tradition to be a golem spell, where you create a clay figurine and you breathe into it the breath of life. And you usually have to soak these in sacrificial blood, too, by the way. And of course, anything that speaks anything else into existence, that's an incantation spell. And somehow, creationists think that anything that science can't explain is explained by magic. You can't explain that, therefore, God. As if God is made of the things we don't know. As if unexplained means explained by magic. And even the things that science does explain, if the answer is complicated, then religion still wins. Because belief in magic wishes is a whole lot easier for some people to grasp than complicated concepts that require prior understanding or in-depth knowledge. And evoking supernatural explanations doesn't actually explain anything, but it eases the mind who can't or won't understand otherwise. And remember that a lot of these people don't want to know what the truth really is. They think that criticizing natural explanations somehow proves the supernatural, that if you think that evolution is impossible, that somehow makes a magical creation possible. They don't understand the logical fallacy, the false dichotomy. They don't understand the concept of the null set, or the idea that gods and magic are not the default position, that if you can disprove science, well then that reveals gods and magic. No. When you don't have an explanation, it means you don't have an explanation. You're still looking for one. And the option that they have suggested is an unsupported assertion and therefore unworthy of serious consideration. Understand that positive claims require positive evidence even when you're talking about a God. Now, you're free to believe in a God. You're welcome to believe in any horse shit you like. But if you don't have any evidence to show that your claims are correct, that one of the ways I like to put it is if you can't confirm the accuracy of any of your claims to any degree at all, by any means whatsoever, then logically you cannot actually know what you claim to know, that you really only believe that. And it is dishonest to assert as fact that which is not evidently true, yet that's what all religions do. Religion has always been a means of manipulation of the masses, and they do this by the indoctrination of faith, often targeting young children before they reach the age of reason. Because if you wait until they're 8 or more years old, and then you tell them about Noah's Ark, and sticks turning into snakes, and the sun stopping in the sky, and especially Adam and Eve, and all of this requires that they unknow everything they already know to be true, you're going to have a hard time brainwashing that child. But if you get them before that age, you can convince them of all kinds of irreconcilable nonsense. And because religion stunts intellectual development, they may never develop the ability to question that. And it's not enough that they deceive their own children, because if yours are the only kids on the block who believe in talking snakes and donkeys, and the tower to heaven, and guys living inside fish, then through peer pressure alone, they're not going to believe that very long. So all their peers have to believe the same thing too. And consequently, Christian schools have sprung up all over my country so that all these kids are taught the Bible as if it were real, and no one is taught evolution. But that's not good enough, because religion is a delusion that needs to infect everybody. In 1999, the Discovery Institute, an organization dedicated to making creationism seem scientific, accidentally released an internal memo not intended for worldwide distribution. And it held a long-term agenda to defeat scientific materialism and its destructive moral, cultural, and political legacies, and to replace materialistic explanations with the theistic understanding that nature and human beings were created by God. They meant to replace evolution with creationism, not just in the Christian schools, but in every school across the country. This was called a wedge because they intended to use pseudoscience arguments to generate doubt, not just in evolution, but in science in general, and thus creating an opening for religious beliefs. And their ultimate goal was to reshape our entire culture by promoting evangelical Protestant Christian fundamentalism at all levels of society, including government. The wedge document from the Discovery Institute mirrored the agenda of, or the goals of, other fundamentalist organizations like the Chalcedon Institute, which ran from the 1960s through the 1990s. The Chalcedon Institute's goal was to eventually, slowly, legally, and peacefully take over all American government and turn it into a theocracy that would enforce biblical law. And their founder, R.J. Rushdoony, specified that what he meant by that was the barbaric book of Leviticus, where women could be killed just for being raped, and where homosexuals would be killed as an abomination. This was the Christian version of Sharia law, where it would be imposed even on unbelievers. It was called Reconstructionism, or also called theonomy, God's law. And a number of Chalcedon Institute's affiliates and subordinates were connected with other devoutly religious hate groups. And in fact, they themselves are listed in the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group. But there's also the Rutherford Institute, which was founded by Chalcedon. Now, the Rutherford Institute's goal was to get evangelical Christians elected at all levels of government, with the ultimate intent that they completely take over political conventions, which they have effectively done. Many of our senators and judges and so forth have been connected to Chalcedon or Rutherford or other similar hardcore evangelical organizations and institutions. Information on all these conspiracies are detailed in their own words on various websites. And as I said, they all but succeeded. They still can't enforce biblical law. Another form of dominionism is represented by the presidential candidate Ted Cruz, who reportedly holds to the New Apostolic Reformation, in which Christians are to reclaim the 7 mountains of culture: government, religion, media, family, business, education, and arts and entertainment. A lot of this is funded by very wealthy conservatives, like the Koch brothers. And these are a set of billionaires who have donated tens of millions of dollars to evangelical organizations, even though they haven't seemed to have expressed any evangelical beliefs themselves. It seems that these are the people that understand that religion is useful and a means of manipulation, though they also support practically everything that goes on in the Republican Party. And there was recently an admission from within that the Republican Party is owned and controlled by the Koch brothers. And back home in Texas, we have our own financier of fundamentalism. James Leininger has a couple $100 million, and he has invested large sums of his money into various religious and political groups in order to change policy. He is the reason that we have a Republican majority on the Supreme Court, because American politics is all about money. You can basically buy elections. James Leininger is also a big fan of school vouchers, and this is where money from the government that's supposed to go to public schools ends up being rerouted to charter schools and private schools. This leaves the privileged kids going to the charter schools and the private schools, and the underprivileged kids are now in underfunded schools, which statistically cause them to underperform. James Leininger, like a lot of Right-wing Republicans don't like the fact that Texas Constitution has a provision where we must provide a free education for all of our citizens, but the only way that they can amend that in the Constitution is to show that the Texas education system has failed, and the only way to show that is to have made it fail. So they route money to other schools, like charter schools, which can't be regulated properly and are prone to corruption. And almost all of the private schools are exclusively Christian schools teaching that the Bible is the only source of truth in our world, which means more kiddies being taught biblical lessons as if it were actual history, and fewer kids understanding reality. James Leininger has also paid tens of thousands of dollars each to seat right-wing Republican Christian conservative creationists on our State Board of Education. Texas has a board of panelists who approve all of our textbooks, but they don't just approve what's already out there, they also change them. They request revisions, paraphrasing, rephrasing, however necessary, in order to censor certain ideas and promote other ideas according to their agenda. Publishers cannot refuse these requests because Texas is one of the largest textbook buyers, and if California isn't buying that year, then what happens is the publishers will produce a Texas-specific textbook which will then be distributed to everyone else, such that this dozen or so volunteers somehow controls the education for everyone in the country. And I should specify that some of these people on the Board of Education have been famously grossly undereducated. There are some that have advanced degrees, but there are others who have only been homeschool their own kids, and speak out against public education. One of them wrote a book saying that public education was a tool of the devil because it didn't promote Jesus. Another famously said that all this critical thinking stuff is gobbledygook, and children should be allowed to jump to their own conclusions. So Leininger gave tens of thousands of dollars to each of these largely undereducated people who had no competence for the job. And our governor, which Leininger also helped place, our former governor, Rick Perry, has repeatedly chosen the most batshit crazy fundamentalists on the board to serve as chairman of the board. And the result of that has been an international embarrassment, so that people in other countries, in Australia, for example, know who my chairman of the board is, or at least at that time, because this was the guy who would readily dismiss the combined testimony of 150 scientists because he's a dentist who thinks he can stand up to experts. I had a debate with this guy where he was supposed to moderate a debate. There was two people on the Board of Education that were supposed to moderate in this debate that my wife set up, where I was debating against two evangelical ministers. One of them admitted that he knew that there were transitional species in the fossil record, but he wanted to teach students there were none, because he said it was important that they believe there are none. So here is an admission that it is okay to lie to other people's kids in order to control what they believe.
Yeah, I think that, as Michael said, I think this is a very important conversation to have. As many of you know, I've spent the last few years publicly criticizing religion. The first thing you encounter when you do that are all the reasons why people think that's a terrible idea. And the first reason is never that there's so much evidence for the existence of God. The truth claim of religion is rarely what you meet, even when you're talking to fundamentalists. What you hear, rather, is that religion is the only context in which to talk about morality. It's the only kind of universal framework on offer in which to answer questions of right and wrong and good and evil. Now, I used to think that was a totally empty argument, and it is indeed a bad argument. It's not even an argument, because even if religion were an engine of moral behavior, that wouldn't prove that it was true. I mean, it certainly wouldn't prove the existence of God. It wouldn't resolve the obvious contradictions between the world's religions. So it is kind of a non sequitur as a defense of belief in God. But I've come to feel that it's actually not a totally empty concern, because I'm continually colliding now with people in the secular community who seem quite confused about how we can think about moral truth in universal terms. And I'll give you the instance which I talk about in the book where this was really seared onto my brain. I was at an academic conference talking, as I will today, about how we can think about morality in scientific terms. And I said in this context something that I thought would be quite uncontroversial. I said, listen, we know that morality has to relate to human and animal well-being at some level. We know that human and animal well-being at some level must relate to the laws of nature and to the ways in which conscious experience arises in this universe. And therefore we know that there are going to be right and wrong answers to these questions, and it's just patently obvious that certain cultures are not maximizing human well-being at this moment. And I cited as an example the violent misogyny and religious bamboozlement of the Taliban as a culture that was not perfectly conducive to human well-being. Now, it turns out to criticize the Taliban at a scientific meeting is to court controversy. And so after I spoke, another speaker came up to me and said, well, how could you ever say, from the point of view of science, that the compulsory veiling of women is wrong? I said, well, the moment you relate right and wrong to the question of how human beings flourish, then I think it's pretty easy to see that forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is not a way of maximizing human well-being. And she said, well, that's just your opinion. Wait, it gets better. And I said, okay, well, let's make it easier. Let's just imagine we found a culture that was removing the eyeballs of every third child. Okay, would you then agree that we had found a culture that was not perfectly maximizing human well-being? And she said, it would depend on why they were doing it. I said, okay, after I picked my jaw up off the floor, I said, okay, let's say they're doing it for religious reasons. Let's say they have a scripture which says every third should walk in darkness, or some such nonsense. And then, without hesitation, she said, then you could never say that they were wrong. Okay, now this person has since been appointed to the President's Council for Bioethics. She's one of 13 people advising our president on all of the ethical implications of progress in medicine and life science generally. Needless to say, she has a background in philosophy and science, and she had just delivered a, to my eye, totally lucid lecture on the ethical implications as she saw them for neuroscience in the courts. She was very worried that we would be using lie detection technology prematurely. She viewed this as an invasion of cognitive liberty, even with captured terrorists. She was worried that we would be scanning the brains of people like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and this seemed like an Orwellian overreach for her. She was especially worried that we could be exposing captured terrorists to the hormone oxytocin, which mediates trust in the human brain, and it's harmless to be exposed to it, but it seems to generate trust in people. This was just unthinkable that we would be doing this. So on the one hand, you have someone whose moral scruples are really finely calibrated to our own possible missteps, and yet she's quite sanguine about the ritual enucleation of children. And it seemed to me totally detached from the unnecessary misery of millions of women living in the Muslim world at this moment. So I perceive a problem with this, and while this is the most glaring instance of it, I get this by the hundreds and thousands in emails and blog comments that people think, disproportionately well-educated and liberal and affluent people seem to think, that something has occurred in the last 200 years of intellectual progress that has made it impossible to speak about moral truth. And this worries me because I think we are in danger of waking up in a world where the only people who are sure that there are right answers to moral questions are religious demagogues who think the universe is 6,000 years old and think they got these answers from a voice in a whirlwind. And so I'm going to be trying to rehabilitate some of your intuitions about moral truth over the course of the next hour.
And do you think all religion is equally bad?
No, of course not. I think all religion is probably equally misguided, but some religions are worse than others where their effect upon human behavior is concerned.
Is that why you said that you thought Islam was the greatest evil today, a few years ago?
Yes. I think that's true, where only today, mind you. I mean, in medieval times, Christianity was. But Christianity has rather sort of grown out of that.
And do you still think Islam is the greatest evil today?
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think that nationalism, patriotism really, where you say my country right or wrong, America first, these are also great evils which we would be better off without.
Why did you stop believing then, as a child?
Oh, I stopped believing for various reasons. I mean, first of all, because I realized, I think my mother woke me up to this, that there are lots of different religions and they're all incompatible, so they can't all be right. So why would you assume that the one you happen to have been brought up in is right? That was when I was about 9. But then I kind of reverted and got confirmed, and then I finally gave it up at the age of about 15 or 16 when I understood about Darwin, because I was left with a kind of residual deism where I believed not in the particular Christian God, but in some kind of supernatural creator, some kind of creative intelligence. And I gave that up when I understood Darwin.
But why does Darwin extinguish, in your mind, the idea of an original creator?
Because the original creator was persuasive to me, because I was very inspired and impressed by the living world. And so when I saw a moth that looked exactly like the bark it's sitting on, when I saw a panther that's such an exquisitely designed hunter, when I saw an antelope that was exquisitely designed to escape from predators, everywhere you look in the living world, as I was doing, studying biology, it has apparent design written all over it. And it was only when I understood that Darwin had an alternative explanation, a much better explanation for apparent design. It isn't design at all. It's produced by the non-random process called Darwinian natural selection. Once I understood that, there was no longer any need for God. God became positively superfluous, unnecessary and superfluous.
I mean, that's what outgrowing God does. It takes you through all of these notions that we have or are brought up with or are taught in one way or another about what the reasons for our beliefs might be, and tries to cross them out, if you like. But if you take your own experience, which was that Darwinism drew you away from believing in God, why didn't you end up in a situation where you thought, well, maybe God started it all off, and then Darwinism took over?
Yes, that's a good question. The reason for that is that Darwin solved the big problem. The apparent design of living creatures is the really big problem, and that was really compelling. Before Darwin came along, it was very difficult to be an atheist. The origin of everything, the idea that God just started it off, the idea that God sort of, so to speak, began the process of evolution and then sat back and did nothing. That's very unpersuasive, because having got rid of God for the big problem, which is the apparent design and diversity of living things, why would you smuggle him in for just a little problem right at the very beginning?
Do you think we'll work it out in our lifetimes, where it all began?
I don't know about in our lifetime. I mean, I think it's...
Well, in 100 years, then.
The history of science gives us every encouragement. I mean, it one by one, the various problems have fallen to science.
I mean, that's a matter of faith, isn't it? I mean, you're sort of...
You could call it faith if you like, but I think it's a matter of historical precedent. It's a matter of the experience of science. If you think about what we now know compared to what our ancestors knew 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, it's a magnificent progress towards understanding everything. Maybe we won't ever understand everything, but the record shows that we're on the right path.
Do you think we would behave better without religion? Doesn't religion give us codes, rules by which to live?
Yes, and they're pretty awful, aren't they? If you think about the codes that are given us by the Bible, especially the Old Testament, obviously. I mean, anybody who lived their life according to the morality of the Old Testament would be an appalling person you would not wish to know. I mean, stoning people to death for breaking the Sabbath, stoning witches, persecuting homosexuals, and so on and so forth. The New Testament's a bit better. I mean, Jesus was obviously a very, very nice person. If he lived, I mean, either Jesus was a nice person or whoever wrote his lines was a very nice person.
Quite rude to his mother.
Well, yes, but that, can perhaps overlook that. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is classically regarded as a very, very wonderful set of rules for living, and indeed it is. But taken as a whole, the Bible is a terrible set of rules for living, and given that there are a few nice bits, you have then to have a criterion for which bits you decide are the nice bits, like the Sermon on the Mount. And the criterion by which we decide that has to be non-biblical, otherwise it's a circular argument. So we can look through the Bible and cherry-pick the bits that we regard as good, and we do that. But then why bother with the Bible at all? If we've got a criterion for cherry-picking, let's just use that criterion and live our lives by moral standards, which we are given by moral philosophers and by the general progress in morality, which we see as we look from century to century, decade to decade, actually. It's that quick.
So just before the Wedge document was accidentally leaked, I had already heard from a number of evangelicals bragging that they had positioned certain judges and senators and so forth for the next stage of their perceived culture war. And that next stage was detailed in the Wedge document once it finally came out. The Discovery Institute is not a science organization, as they bill themselves to be. They're really more of a league of lawyers. And so what they had done was to put conservative Christian judges all over the country, coordinated effort through all these different church groups, voting as a block, just like their ministers tell them to do, despite their tax-free status not having any threat of that. And the purpose was so that they could countersue whenever anybody tried to sue their school districts for being, teaching pseudoscience. And this finally happened in Dover, Pennsylvania. Creationists in the public schools there didn't want to hear the name of Darwin. They didn't want to hear about evolution. They encouraged their Board of Education, their school boards, to adopt an intelligent design textbook called Of Pandas and People. The purpose of the phrase intelligent design is an illusion meant to create the impression that there is a scientific objection to evolution. Their previous attempt to do this was called creation science. But the veneer was too thin, and a judge saw that it was just pseudoscience propaganda meant to promote religion, and this was why in 1987 it became illegal to teach creationism in public schools. But religion is relentless, and they think they're in a culture war. So they invented intelligent design so that they could spew the same nonsense and continue on in secular schools. I was in studio in TV for a local, in Dallas for a local TV show where they were doing a comparison of worldviews. So they had three men on stage. First, they had a evolutionist. This is the way they build it, as if accepting scientific facts is equivalent to a religion. Then on the other side of the stage, they had a creationist, and in the middle, they had an intelligent design proponent. They did not admit that he was a creationist also, because they wanted to create that illusion that this was something in the middle, something with scientific justification. And remember, these people knew better and are deliberately lying. And the way we know that is investigators in the Dover trial discovered that the textbook Of Pandas and People had been printed in multiple editions, including prior to the ruling in 1987, where it was illegal to teach creationism in public schools. So they compared the first edition to the most recent edition, and what they discovered was that there was only one significant change. Wherever the word creationism originally appeared, it had been replaced. In 1987, a macro command replaced it with the words intelligent design, including the definition, so that intelligent design and creationism are the same thing. They have the same definition, but creationists are still lying about that. And the other change that's connected to that was that whenever it originally said creationists, It now says design proponents. Except one place where there was a misspelling that confused the macro command, and it said see design proponentsists. So they knew full well what they were doing. They were lying to get around the law to do something illegal. These are the people who promote morality. So it is not possible to defend creationism honestly, but it didn't matter that it wasn't enough that they caught their witnesses lying again and again and again. Because it had gone to court, it was now incumbent on the court to show that there was no truth to their claims. And this is where they thought that having a George Bush appointed conservative Christian Republican judge would assure their success, because creationists never admit when they're wrong. However, simply being Christian doesn't mean that you're a religious extremist. It doesn't mean that you're a reality denialist. And the judge in this case was a moderate Christian and a proper judge. And he lamented the fact that so many of these witnesses would so proudly tout their religious convictions in public, as he put it, and then time and again lie to cover their tracks and conceal the real purpose behind the ID policy. For example, Dr. Michael Behe took the stand as the only biologist willing to defend intelligent design. And he confidently said that science will never find an evolutionary explanation for the immune system. But the judge noted that he was presented with 58 peer-reviewed publications, 9 books, and several immunology textbook chapters about the evolution of the immune system. However, he simply insisted that this was still not sufficient evidence of evolution and that it wasn't good enough. The court also ruled that all of the testable claims of intelligent design had already been refuted and rejected by science. So the science deniers didn't get the ruling that they wanted. And nor would they admit that they had lost the court case. Instead, legions of them found an alternate plan. In each of the states, many of them, they found loopholes in the different education systems laws, allowing, for different reasons in different places, that there would be thousands of schools across the United States that will not teach evolution, and there are thousands more that teach creationism, or more specifically to teach the Bible as if it were a matter of historic and scientific fact. Now, these lessons have also been shown to include anti-Semitism, and of course a rejection of science, as well as a denigration of other religions, and the instilling of right-wing political ideologies, which is what this is really all about. Bear with me a moment. Now, they also had a program called the Good News Clubs, which was billed as after-school activities and seems perfectly harmless, but what they really do is full-tilt evangelizing to young students, often regardless of parental consent. They not only fill their heads full of Jesus, they also train the kids how to react when their parents object to these kinds of lessons. So they're dividing the children from their parents. And I don't know how this goes on without lawsuits all over the place, but it's been happening for years. But the culture war isn't just about instilling religious dogmatism, it's also about impressing the oppression, repression, and political practices consistent with religious fundamentalism. And in Texas, that meant no more sex education. Instead, they teach abstinence only. My wife was teaching middle school when they had a state-funded Christian conservative, an old guy with a belt up to here, who came into the class to lie to the students, saying, among other things, that oral sex didn't feel good. And somebody brought up, the last time I mentioned this, they brought up that it might be because so many of the kids had braces. The reason he gave was that you're so worried about catching a sexually transmitted disease that you can't enjoy the blowjob. Abstinence only is the idea that any pill can serve as a birth control pill if the girl holds it between her knees. Literally, they do nothing more than simply tell teenagers not to have sex, as if that would work. that all you have to do is deny one of the strongest biological urges that any organism has, and you have to do that at the peak of its chemical and social influence over you, and that you have to do this with no understanding of it because we're not going to give you any useful information because we're afraid you'll use it. The Abstinence Only program brags that it is the only 100% effective way to prevent pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases. However, just before my wife and I left Texas to go on this tour, we noted that one of the local high schools was reporting a chlamydia outbreak. Texas has one of the highest rates of teen pregnancy. I think it's the second highest rate of teen pregnancy. And we also have the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancy. And just to share how bad our education system is, one of the news stories, and I'm not kidding about this, said that the trend in teen pregnancies falls back down once the children reach 25. We also have one of the highest rates of child poverty because it's a negative feedback loop. They've canceled, the right-wing Republicans have famously canceled all of our abortion clinics and have done everything they could to cut the education budget in half and to also end social benefit programs that would have aided unwed mothers, teen mothers, and so forth. The program has been such a colossal failure that I'm happy to announce that President Obama has just a month or so ago canceled federal funding for it because it was the federal government paying for that for about a decade. So it's not enough that our kids are poor and pregnant. No, they don't know how things work. It's not enough that they're religious because the system that did that ultimately wants to control how they vote so that they will elect extreme militant right-wing ideologues wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. And how do you inspire such jingoism? Through fear and lies. In George Orwell's most famous book, 1984, says that those who control the past control the future. So, of course, our Board of Indoctrination also had to alter our history in subtle ways that they hoped no one would notice. And the goal here was to promote American exceptionalism. The idea that our political system and our values were unique in all the world and that our history follows along manifest destiny, which was something they actually taught me in school. And this meant, well, I remember going back to people saying that the United States was founded by God and guided by God, right? Directed by God. And this meant that certain embarrassing errors in our history had to be glossed over, minimized, or omitted. So, for example, Christianity is credited with everything good that ever happened, but our embarrassing history with slavery and civil rights are minimized, as if it wasn't really all that bad, or maybe it didn't happen at all. Rather than admit that the Civil War was fought over slavery, our history books now say that it was fought over states' rights. And slavery was seldom mentioned at all. As a matter of fact, one of the textbooks got sued because it referred to the slaves as workers. So in Texas, these classes are also often called social studies rather than history because it is a blend of cultural ancestries. But our Texas history, or social studies textbooks have omitted most ethnic references to indigenous people and other ethnicities, and everything has been reworded so that it seems that only white people ever did anything important. For example, in one of our textbooks, when once mentioned hip-hop music, it was changed to country western. There was an attempt to remove a few Latino heroes, and also it was a failed attempt to remove Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall because they didn't want to have a black role model in a respected position of authority. Our history books have arguments supporting segregation, and while they don't say anything negative about the Ku Klux Klan in Texas, Louisiana's textbooks, one of them, describes the KKK as respected community leaders promoting morality. Louisiana uses overtly Christian books, including the Bible itself, because it's one of those states where it is legal now to teach full-on creationism. And our friend Zach Copeland was a high school student when that became legal, and he became an activist trying to sue his state over this. And a lot of the information that I'm going to be presenting here actually comes from his website, where he's named different textbooks and what they say. His textbooks in Louisiana, not his, but Louisiana's books, promote paranoid and prejudiced propaganda, instilling and spreading right-wing religious ideology, including the denigration of gays, liberals, and otherwise celebrated thinkers like Emily Dickinson and Mark Twain. One of Louisiana's textbooks describes Mark Twain as a confused hack. One of Louisiana's textbooks says that the goal of environmentalism isn't to preserve natural resources for future generations, but rather the goal of environmentalism is to destroy the economies of the world's richest nations. Why does the textbook say that? Because we're addicted to fossil fuels and we must promote the oil industry. So this is the propaganda that we're taught in our schools accordingly. There's one textbook in Louisiana that says that homosexuality should be treated as a capital crime. And one of the Louisiana science textbooks says that the existence of the Loch Ness Monster disproves evolution. Nationwide, our children are taught that the founding fathers were Christian when many were not, and we were told that our nation was based on biblical values of the Ten Commandments when there's no truth to that at all. But our history books now say that Moses was a historic person, that he was born in the 13th century BCE, even though biblical scholars can't agree on when he should have been born, and many say that he was never born at all. And archaeologists agree almost unanimously, saying that the way the Bible describes the Exodus is not the way it happened, if it happened at all, and now we know several reasons that it couldn't have happened at all. The consensus among critical scholars is that there's no truth to the Exodus whatsoever. But our history books back the Bible. And Moses is listed first among the authors who inspired the framers of the Constitution. And there's a footnote advising the kids to read the Bible for more information about Moses. But the fact is that our founders were famously, adamantly against every system of government that is associated with Moses. And if Moses existed, he certainly would have objected to anything democratic. Our books now say that the political thinking of the framers of our Constitution was based on Judeo-Christian religious heritage, where our laws and rights are believed to have come from God rather than legislators. But logically, I think that if gays and atheists have equal rights in one country but face execution in another, then those rights did not come from God, or they would be universal and worldwide. And if a woman has a right to drive in one country but not in another, then we know that that right was bestowed by a human legislator in recent times. And again, this seems obvious to a lot of people, but you should see me trying to explain this to Tea Partiers, religious right people back home in Texas. So none of these changes in the books that we've been talking about are factually correct. And this is easily proven. But it doesn't matter that you can prove that all of these things are lies, because this is what every child is taught in every school, everywhere across the country, again and again and again, by every authority figure they know. And it isn't possible to reach all of these kids to undo the damage before it sets in, because this is a form of programming. Many Americans don't realize they've been lied to until they go to college, which many don't, because my country no longer respects higher education the way we used to. And we don't respect academic expertise either. So if the overwhelming majority of the world's scientists have achieved consensus on climate change, evolution, sustainable energy, or some other unpopular notion, religious believers will simply dismiss it as if the opinionated, uneducated, ignorant masses somehow know better than all the world's best educated expert specialists anywhere ever. And as I said, I've been giving this presentation across Europe. And I asked them, if you've been watching our political circus from abroad, shaking your head in wonder at the ineptitude of even those applying for our highest position, you're wondering what the hell happened in the United States? You started out so promising. Where did you go wrong? This is it, and this is how they've perpetuated through the denigration of education and the systematic, system-wide religious indoctrination attempting to turn us all into sheep. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Right. I thought you were going to ask me what I would say to God if, and I have it in here. I do.
Do you say F God?
I wouldn't use the F word because, if there's a God, then I've got to start being nice. By the way, on the agnostic, the 17-year-old is agnostic. I have a long discussion on that too because it's one of these words that bothers atheists, agnostic, And then I remember when I was on Colbert the last time, he told me that an agnostic is just an atheist without balls. And I thought, oh, yeah, I don't want to be one of those guys. So, yeah, okay. These are just labels that we use to shortcut thinking about what people believe. I don't like them because I'd rather just describe what I believe. Do you believe in God? No. Okay, then, end of story. That's different than, of course, technically saying I can't prove there's a God. Does that make me a strong atheist or a weak atheist or a militant agnostic? I don't know and you don't either, like the bumper sticker said. There's a whole series of those jokes. Okay, here's what I would say if it turns out there's a God. So it's not funny. It's what I would actually say, I think. Lord, I did the best I could with the tools you granted me. You gave me a brain to think skeptically, and I used it accordingly. You gave me the capacity to reason, and I applied it to all claims, including that of your existence. You gave me a moral sense, and I felt the pangs of guilt and the joys of pride for the bad and good things I chose to do. I tried to do unto others as I would have them do unto me, and although I fell far short of this ideal far too many times, I tried to apply your foundational principle whenever I could. Whatever the nature of your immortal and infinite spiritual essence actually is, as a mortal, finite, corporeal being, I cannot possibly fathom it despite my best efforts. And so, do with me what you will. That's what I'm going to say. Thank you. Although I'm pretty confident I'll never have to say it, so I haven't written it on my palm like Sarah does. Pretty confident. Yeah, I'm right, really super confident. I'd be shocked, in fact, if it turned out there was a God. I would be. I'd say, is this a Penn and Teller thing? I mean, come on. I've seen Copperfield do better than this, right? Like if there was a resurrection, come on. I've seen this on stage.
The Christian church, or should we just say Christians in general, have believed some effed up things throughout history, man. And in today's video, I'd like to take a look at a few examples of such cases. And most of these aren't just cases where faith harmed no one and it was just a personal, private thing. As you're about to see, these doctrines left a trail of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of bodies throughout history, man. So without further ado, let's dive right in and get started. Let's first turn to the curious case of the witches' mark. In the late medieval and early modern periods, the church was deeply involved in the persecution of alleged witches. One of key pieces of evidence that was used to convict witches was the presence of a witch's mark, which was basically a blemish or mole on the skin that was said to be the devil's seal. This belief was rooted in the idea that witches made pacts with the devil, who would then mark them as his own. Now, the problem, of course, is that these marks were, as you've guessed, ordinary skin conditions or birthmarks, man. Yet, at the height of the witch hunts, they were seen as incontrovertible proof of guilt, man. Thousands of people, mostly women, were tortured and executed, and all based on this flawed belief, man. And that's why to this day the witch trials stand as a stark reminder of how dogma, when combined with fear and superstition, can lead to a horrific series of injustices. And unsurprisingly, it wasn't until the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and evidence, that the witch hunts finally came to an end. So, the next fascinating example is the belief in the doctrine of signatures. This medieval idea held that God had created plants with specific shapes and colors to indicate their medicinal uses. For example, walnuts, which resembled the human brain, was thought to be good for treating headaches. Similarly, lungwort, a plant with spotted leaves, was believed to cure lung diseases. This belief was rooted in the idea that God had left clues in nature for humans to decipher and make use of. Now, to be fair, this concept did not originate with the church. The concept dates from the time of Dioscorides and Galen, who were both renowned scientists, but not long after they proposed the theory and it was accepted in society, the church miraculously sprung a theological justification for this philosophy out of nowhere. Particularly the writings of Jacob Boehme, a Lutheran Protestant theologian, were instrumental in spreading this doctrine of signatures. Now, while the doctrine of signatures did actually lead to some accidental discoveries, it was ultimately a flawed approach to medicine, and it wasn't until the rise of modern pharmacology and the scientific method that we started to understand the true properties of plants and the effects on the human body. Yet, guys, for centuries, this belief shaped medical practices, demonstrating how easily dogma can distort our understanding of the natural world, man. Now, let's take a look at the belief in the spontaneous generation of insects. Now, while I did already touch on spontaneous generation in last week's video, one of them, I think it was on Wednesday, it is still worth noting that this idea extended to insects as well. Medieval Christians believed that insects like fleas, lice, and flies could arise spontaneously from dirt or decaying matter, and this belief was partly rooted in the biblical idea that God had created all living things from nothing. But it did also reflect a lack of understanding of insect life cycles. And again, as with all things in the scientific realm, it wasn't until the 17th century that scientists like Francesco Redi began challenging this idea. Redi's particular experiment with rotting meat, as I also mentioned last week, proved that maggot only appeared when flies laid eggs on the meat. And even though this discovery was a major blow to the idea of spontaneous generation, it still took centuries for the belief to fully disappear. Now, next, let's take a look at the belief in the philosopher's stone. This mythical substance was said to have the power to turn base metals like lead into gold, and was also said to be able to grant eternal life, man. And this was a particularly interesting one for me because extensive belief in the philosopher's stone swept across all major religions of the world, from the Muslims and Christians to Buddhism and even Hinduism, man. The equivalent of the philosopher's stone in Buddhism and Hinduism was called the Sintamani, and it was called the elixir in Arabic. By the way, this is where the word elixir is derived from. So yeah, while the search for the philosopher's stone is often associated with alchemy today, it was also embraced by the Catholic Church, who saw it as a symbol of spiritual transformation. The idea was rooted in the belief that God had hidden secrets in nature waiting to be discovered by the faithful. Now, of course, the philosopher's stone was never found, and the pursuit of it led many alchemists down fruitless paths, man. And yet, as with all other dogmas, the belief in its existence still persisted for centuries, fueled by a combination of hope, mysticism, and blind faith. It wasn't until the rise of modern chemistry that the idea was finally abandoned, as scientists began to understand the true nature of matter and the impossibility of transmuting elements without nucleus reactions. Now, finally, let's take a look at the belief in incorruptibility, which was a Catholic and Orthodox belief that divine intervention allows some human bodies, specifically saints, to completely or partially avoid the normal process of decomposition after death, which was supposed to be a sign of their holiness. Needless to say, this idea was rooted in the concept of bodily resurrection and the belief that saints were especially favored by God. So when the bodies of certain saints were found to be remarkably well preserved, it was seen as a miracle and proof of their holiness. However, modern science has shown that the preservation of bodies can be explained by natural processes such as mummification or the conditions of the burial site. Yet, for centuries, the belief in the incorruptibility of saints' bodies was taken as evidence of divine intervention within Christian circles. So this example illustrates how easily natural phenomena can be misinterpreted when viewed through the eyes of dogma. So that's it for today. As we reflect on these examples, it's obvious that a common theme is emerging, which is the tension between belief and evidence, between dogma and discovery, a tale as old as time, man. So man, thanks a lot for sticking with me to the end of this video, man. If you've liked the video, please remember to smash the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also leave a comment, because that usually helps the algorithm push the video to even more people who might need to hear the arguments. I really hope that you've loved it, man. Once again, thanks a lot. If you'd like to see me feature anyone that you find particularly interesting in future videos, kindly name them in the comment section below. Other than that, thanks a lot, man, for your continued support, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace, man.